One thing that stood out
Go
for
ahead.
me in those schools, I just wanted to let you know on that question, something that stood out for me was that those 8 were all small schools, which I think this measure is intended in a way to provide that help. Please continue though, Member Ruiz. Did you have another question or comment for Andrea?
No, I was just kind of waiting to see if I'm trying to understand the Appendix A.
Oh, right.
That was in the material on the website. I was just trying to understand that Appendix A, but
Andrea, what's that document called? Because I don't see an Appendix A.
Yeah, it's Agenda Item F, options to allow use of cash reserves. And then it's on the last page of that document that's posted on the website.
Okay.
We will get that.
if you want to, I don't want to hold up. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So could you? So
I got more to do.
You've got it broken out: small, medium, large, and then less than, and then all of a sudden, as you go down. So are you saying? So the total 407. That's the total number of in the portfolio. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the total number of, this was based on 2022, so that was the total number of audits received.
Got it. And so then below that dark line, you're saying that of those with 60 or more days, now you start to get into that 120, 150, 180, 300, there's 13 small schools with 350 or more days. Is that correct?
Correct. And those 13 are part of the 89. So you're understanding that correctly.
Okay. All right. Okay. So a lot of the small schools have a lot of built up, I guess, reserves then.
Correct. And they face intervention if they
use it.
If they spend significant portion, any amount of it, really, of any substance.
Okay. Versus on the large chart, you have 97, and none of them are at 365 days. So okay, I understand it now. Thank you.
Member Swanson, did you have a question or comment?
Well, thank you, Carlos. I had the same question. I was looking at the same chart, trying to figure that out. I get it. It seems to me that that this is fine. And then Wendy, but did you want to mess with the 120?
I think that 90 would be more fair and would keep, Andrea, looking at schools that really need it as opposed to schools that are spending their reserves. So yes, I think this measure would be more sound at 90 days. Since that's what, a third more than we're actually going to stop at 45 based on our current proposal for days liquidity to meet. So 90 would be doubling that for schools to be able to qualify for this exception.
Could we also maybe, because you're gonna, if somebody uses it and so they say they're at 90 days, they're using their reserves and they're at 90 days, and we're trying to get people to stick to 45. Could they? You wouldn't want them to use their reserves to get them down to 30, right?
Right, great question. Yeah,
you probably want them to only use the amount of reserves that wouldn't cause them to go lower than where we want them to be, I guess. Maybe something like that.
Absolutely. Well, and so this, in context, at least if I'm understanding it correctly, Andrea, this right here, this measure would be after the money has been spent. That's why I feel like 90 is sound. So after they dropped below, then the expectation to apply this exception, which would only allow them to go up one step, not two, to apply this exception after they've spent those funds or drop down, they'd still have to have at least 90 days liquidity to apply this exception. Is there any public comment before we entertain a motion on this? Did we have anyone that would like to speak to it?
Wendy, this is Steve Durand. I think this is a great thing because those 8 schools, and I just want to thank the board for the time to look at this, because those 8 schools that were put into intervention that had significant reserves, and just because of a measure that maybe didn't understand that, I think this is a huge win. I appreciate the board staff for looking into this. It's a gift to us as charters. And I want to thank the committee for looking at this as well, because this makes a ton of sense and also is a good way to incentivize us as charter school representatives and operators to raise our cash reserves for this reason, for a benefit to us, not necessarily for something punitive, but for something as a gift from the board in order to help us to not borrow money necessarily to make capital purchases, but use our own cash that we have accumulated over time and lower our overall debt ratio and increase our fiscal net worth as we're buying things that probably will increase our operations. So I think this is a wonderful thing. And I just want to thank the staff for taking the time to look at this, and for this subcommittee for really engaging with the staff to make sure that this kind of a proposal goes through. This is a great thing for charters.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that feedback. I believe we've got Charter Association up to make a comment. Amanda?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Chairwoman Miller. Yeah, I also want to echo some of those same sentiments that Steve Durand just said. We really appreciate the flexibility within this measure. It seems like the board staff is extremely responsive to incidents that have caught schools, you know, in prior in prior situations, that when using their cash reserves, they don't need to be caught. They're doing it in a really responsible manner, and they shouldn't really have to like be asking to spend their money. And having this framework ahead of time gives them a lot of flexibility and allows them to know ahead of time, like, hey, we know how we can spend our money and we're just going to keep this much cash on hand. I also think that your suggestion to bump it down to 90 days is extremely helpful to lots of schools. When the majority of the portfolio is comprised of medium-sized schools, and I look at Appendix A, there's the biggest difference between those medium schools that have 60 or more days, and then it has the biggest drop off is down to 120 days when compared to the small or the large schools. And so allowing, and that's the bulk of the portfolio. And so allowing them to come up to a 90 days, I think then most of your small, medium, and large schools would be able to still spend their cash reserves responsibly. With some of this new information, this is something that we'll be taking back to our working group in case there's other little details that, you know, that I'm not aware of, but I think that most of our schools would be really in favor for this. So thank you.
Thank you for that feedback. Have any other public comments? We may not be able to see your hand, so if you had a comment, now's your chance to jump in. Okay, hearing and seeing none, I think I will venture to put a motion out to my subcommittee. I move that the changes discussed in item F at today's meeting be incorporated into the subcommittee's draft recommendation to the board, using 90 days liquidity instead of 120 days liquidity, which the subcommittee will finalize at a subsequent meeting. I further move the board staff to solicit preliminary public comment on the changes discussed in item F today for a period of not less than 5 business days, and report the results of the public comment to the subcommittee at a subsequent meeting. The subcommittee shall consider the results of the preliminary public comment when considering its final recommendation to the board.
I'll second that.
Second. Try it.
Give that second to Mr. Ruiz.
I was waiting for you to unmute, Jim, but it
Didn't happen.
Next time. All right. Mr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller,
Aye.
motion passes.
Thank you. Andrea made mention of it casually during her last presentation, but we did remove item G because it's thick, and we had some interesting calculations going on, and we wanted to ensure that the public and subcommittee could review a wide array of options for calculating net income that took into consideration the feedback we've received from the field and from staff. So we will review those proposed formulas at a subsequent meeting and discuss what needs to be on that agenda later on this agenda, which means that we will move now to item H, which is the lease adjusted debt service coverage ratio. Again, these items are hard to extrapolate. Some of it touches on some of the others, but Andrea, would you mind presenting for us your current proposal for item H?
Yes, subcommittee members, the lease adjusted debt service coverage ratio, or ratio measure, looks at the charter holder's ability to cover its facility and debt costs. The ratio's calculation considers as applicable the charter holder's debt principal, interest expense, and facility lease expense. Under the financial framework, debt principal includes principal payments associated with bonds or loans for a charter holder that purchases its facilities, as well as other long-term loans obtained by a charter holder and capital leases. Many charter holders obtain equipment or vehicles such as buses through capital leases, which are now referred to as finance leases under accounting principles. For the ratio's calculation, staff pulls the debt principal amount from the audited statement of cash flows. Please note that in prior framework versions, principal to be paid during the next fiscal year was used in the calculation. This was changed for the current framework so that all amounts used in the calculation pertain to the audited fiscal year. In most cases, using the amounts from the cash flow statement has worked well. However, there are certain situations, such as when the charter holder pays off its debt early or when a balloon payment must be made, where using amount found on the cash flow statement skews a charter holder's performance. Other situations that occasionally come up include the charter holder refinancing its debt or principal being paid using bond reserve funds. At its November meeting, the subcommittee discussed whether the ratio measure should be modified to handle one or more of these situations, and whether capital finance leases for equipment and vehicles should be removed from the ratio's debt principal definition. Based on those discussions, staff has prepared for the subcommittee's deliberation the full draft proposal found in the staff report for the ratio measure. The draft proposal includes new calculation considerations and changes to the debt principal definition. The proposed calculation considerations, which are have been included on this slide. For a charter holder that pays debt off early, either in full or in part, in the audit fiscal year, the ratio will be meet standard if the only items applicable to the ratio calculation are the debt principal and interest expense associated with the retired debt. If the charter holder has other applicable debt and/or facility lease expense, only those amounts will be used in the ratio calculation and when determining the measure rating. The principal and interest associated with the retired debt will be excluded. For a charter holder with a scheduled balloon payment in the audit fiscal year that does not fully retire the debt, the principal associated with the balloon payment will be excluded from the ratio calculation. The measure rating will be determined based on the ratio calculated using the interest expense associated with the debt subject to the balloon payment, and as applicable, the charter holder's other debt principal, interest expense, and facility lease expense. If the only applicable item for the ratio calculation is the balloon payment itself, the subcommittee must determine today the rating the measure will receive if it decides to proceed with this proposal. For a charter holder that refinances all or some of its debt in the audit fiscal year, the measure rating will be determined based on the ratio calculated using the net principal payments, the interest expense associated with the refinanced debt, and as applicable, the charter holder's other debt principal, interest expense, and facility lease expense. Net principal payments represent the difference between the principal payments made during the audit year on the debt being refinanced and the proceeds from the issuance of the new debt. For example, if the charter holder's existing debt is $1 million and through refinancing, $900,000 in new debt is issued, then $100,000 of debt principal would be included in the calculation, as there was a net decrease in debt of $100,000 during the audit fiscal year. If the charter holder's existing debt is $1 million and through refinancing $1.2 million in new debt is issued, then no debt principal would be included in the calculation, as no debt principal was paid during the audit fiscal year. During the audit fiscal year, there was a net increase in the charter holder's debt of $200,000. If no amount is identified for the ratio calculation, the subcommittee must determine today the rating the ratio measure will receive. Please note that the calculation considerations being used to determine a charter holder's performance on the ratio measure are contingent upon there being sufficient disclosure in the charter holder's audit. As noted earlier, the draft proposal also includes changes to the debt principal definition. Under the proposed definition, the ratio measure calculation would no longer include principal payments associated with equipment and vehicle finance leases if the charter holder's audit includes sufficient detail to separate these payments from other principal payments made. At today's meeting, the subcommittee may decide what changes should be made to the draft proposal and may direct staff to solicit public comment on the draft proposal, which the subcommittee would consider at a subsequent meeting. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Members, questions on this measure? Okay, do we have anybody? Oh, yeah.
I have a
member-
question. This was, I had a hard time understanding this, but what are we trying to catch here? I guess that's my question. What versus the current, what's the improvement? Or, I guess that's probably the better, not what are we trying to catch? What is the improvement of the proposal versus what we have been doing?
Yeah, I think the improvement of the proposal is that currently, especially in the areas of those charters that are paying off their debt early, or those charters that are subject to a balloon payment, our current way of calculating it is such that those charter holders inevitably end up in intervention. And the especially with the first one where you're paying off your debt, that's generally viewed as a very positive thing and is going to have long-term benefits for the school. And to be putting the charter holder in intervention in that situation doesn't make a lot of sense. For the balloon payment, while that's just kind of part of the schedule they have, it skews the performance and may not be indicative of someone that should be, or a charter that should be in intervention. The charter maybe should be, but
Okay.
that balloon payment is really, based on the way we're calculating currently, is really throwing things off. If
Okay.
they've planned for that balloon payment over time, or they should have been planning for
Yeah.
that balloon payment over time, and to kind of determine their performance based on what they were able to generate during just the audit year isn't quite fair.
Okay.
The refinancing is just to make it really clear what we're doing. I don't know that it will necessarily benefit or hurt people. It's just to make it very clear how those situations will be handled in the or in the determination of your performance. And then the changes to the definition, which probably I know was not the reason for your question, but that was just to when it was initially the framework was initially developed, it was thought that everything should probably be part of that debt principle. And at this point in time, it's not clear that the equipment and the vehicles are as an important component as the facilities and other debt that they may have. So it seems like it would be appropriate to kind of, they're usually very small amounts, but to kick those out of the calculation and determination.
Okay, thank you. That was a good, that I kind of was getting that this was a supportive amendment or change in how our measurements, but I just thank you for verifying that that's what my impression was. Thank you.
Yeah, I see these definition changes as an improvement. You know, our schools, like any business, and their covenants often have one of these debt service ratios. So I think it's, you know, imperative that we have it on our dashboard to assist our schools in monitoring it. I think it's nice. I do think it's one of the positive changes to make these suggested changes. Do we have any that kind of account for the same concept? People that are making responsible choices. There is really no way currently in this ratio to account for equity, so I feel like these accommodations maybe balance that out a little bit for folks. Do we have any public comment on this agenda item? Amanda?
Yeah, thank you. I want to just echo what you're saying, Chairwoman Miller, is that this feels very helpful and responsive to issues and circumstances that clearly have come up, you know, during audits under the current framework. I think this is something that we would, because there's a lot of new information and quite a few different calculation considerations, we would like to be able to bring this back to our working group to bring you a little bit more specific feedback on it. So just know that we will be getting you some more information.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comments or questions from our board members?
I did have one more question, if you don't mind. My other question, or my only question, is how prolific is this, or how often has this occurred? You know, does it affect a lot of charters, or is this something that's a new proposal that's kind of going toward exceptions, just a few? How often does this occur every year?
The payment of debt and the balloon payments doesn't happen very often, but we have had schools that have paid off their debt early or had that balloon payment and ended up in intervention. Now, granted, it was only for 1 year, but they ended up in intervention based on the way we calculated it. So when it happens, it has a huge impact, but it doesn't happen very often. Refinancing is probably going to slow down with interest rates the way they are. But again, and I have had conversations with at least one school where they were hesitating to pay off their debt for fear. They were in a position where they could, but they knew if they did that, they would likely end up in intervention. And so I think again, I don't expect it to be happening a lot, but it could happen more when this changes made, because schools will know they won't risk being put in intervention if they make that decision.
Any other public comment? Thank you, Andrea. Okay. I will throw out a motion for my fellow subcommittee members. I move that the lease adjusted debt service coverage ratio measure proposal, hereinafter referred to as the LADCSCR proposal, as presented today and found in the materials for today's meeting, be incorporated by staff into the subcommittee's draft recommendation to the board, which the subcommittee will finalize at a subsequent meeting. I further move to direct board staff to solicit preliminary public comment on the LADSCR proposal discussed today for a period of not less than 5 business days, and report the results of the public comment to the subcommittee at a subsequent meeting. The subcommittee shall consider the results of the preliminary public comment when considering its final recommendation to the board.
Second.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you. All right, moving on to agenda item I, which is circling back to average daily membership measure and rating adjustment. Kind of like the days liquidity measure above, this has 2 items in it, so we would need to be thoughtful of that in our comments and also our consideration for a motion, that we're looking at both the calculation that Andrea has proposed here, and then we're also looking at something that we have already shown sentiment for, which was moving up not just 1 but 2 to meet standards for schools based on some of the outlying factors impacting average daily membership right now, such as our state metrics. So Andrea, with that said, will you please walk us through your average daily membership proposal?
Subcommittee members, at its November meeting, the subcommittee discussed possible changes to the framework's average daily membership or ADM measure and the ADM measures rating adjustment. The subcommittee directed staff to solicit stakeholder feedback on whether to recommend the measures rating adjustment be to meet standard in all situations, as well as on whether the ADM measure should be modified to capture large decreases in ADM that could be lost under the ADM measure's current practice of averaging the 3 most recent growth rates. Within the comment period, 3 stakeholders provided feedback. The feedback may be found on page 1 of the staff report for this agenda item. Subsequently, the Arizona Charter Schools Association provided feedback, which was posted on the board's website with the agenda. Today, the subcommittee will review the stakeholder feedback and deliberate on the draft proposal found in the staff report. To capture large decreases in ADM, like those reflected on this slide, the draft proposal adds consideration to current practice when assigning the measure rating. Currently, the ADM measure determines the growth rate for each of the 3 most recent completed fiscal years and averages them together. In addition to using the average, the draft proposal would also consider the growth rate calculated for the audit year, as well as the calculated change in the charter holder's ADM in the most recent 3-year period. The table included on the next slide for today's meeting identifies the measure ratings under the draft proposal. To put some context around the draft proposal, for the fiscal year 2024 audit cycle, the charter holder's rating on the average daily membership measure would consider the average of the charter holder's annual growth rates for fiscal year 2022, 23, and 24. This is what currently happens under the existing framework. It would also consider the charter holder's annual growth rate for fiscal year 24 and the charter holder's change in ADM from fiscal year 2022 to fiscal year 2024. The draft proposal eliminates the use of different thresholds based on the charter holder's student counts. This results in all charter holders being evaluated using the same thresholds, which are the thresholds currently used for small and medium-sized charter holders. The change in ADM thresholds are new, but have been set to identify large swings in student counts. As an example, for a charter holder to receive a below standard rating due to its change in ADM, the charter holder must have experienced a decrease of 50% or more. As shown on the next slide for today's meeting, under the draft proposal, the ADM measure rating adjustment would be to meet standard in all situations instead of the current practice of only increasing the rating by 1 category. This means as long as the charter holder received no below standard ratings and no more than 1 approaches standard rating on the framework's other 5 measures, the charter holder would receive a meet standard on the ADM measure regardless of its calculated average, its audit year growth rate, or its change in ADM. I'm available for questions.
Andrea, so did you took out the, looks like you took out the small, medium, large, right?
Yeah, if you go back to the previous
From-
slide, that's correct. Everyone
From the last
is,
meeting, okay. And then this one, the last thing you talked about is if they're doing well in other areas, this becomes a non-issue, right?
correct. So Dan, I'm gonna have you jumping all over the place. If you go to the next slide. Previous slide. Yes, that is correct. So even though we're adding all of these different considerations in of looking at the ADM and making sure that we're recognizing those large decreases or decreases that may have happened just in the audit fiscal year. Even with all these things added, if the charter holder has on the framework's other 5 measures, has no below standard ratings and no more than one approaches standard rating, if their performance falls below a meets on the initial calculation, that rating adjustment will still be available. And under your proposal, it would automatically go to a meets standard on this measure. Where in the past, it would go from below to approaches or approaches to meets. Whether you have a below standard or you have an approaches standard, if you meet those other conditions on the other 5 measures, it jumps up to a meets.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure if it came up during this presentation. I apologize. I might have missed it. Did we look at I thought the portfolio graph was pretty important, pretty profound, where it showed changing this rating calculation, how many schools would not have met. I mean, we took out, I realize it doesn't factor in this exception, but
Yeah,
neither
so,
the regional data. So I think that might be helpful for the subcommittee to look at here.
so Dan, I think if you keep clicking through the slides going forward, go one more, yeah. So that this slide shows or reflects the proposal that is before you today. However, this proposal for ease of calculation and determining is without rating adjustments. So the performance of the portfolio is going to be higher than these calculations once the rating adjustments are put in. So the blue column reflects the portfolio's current performance for these current actual performance for 19 through 2022 and an estimate for 2023 with standard rating targets, meaning the percentages are the same for all charters regardless of size, but doesn't include the rating adjustment. The orange part of the graph shows the proposal prior to any rating adjustments being applied.
Thank you, Andrea. I think this data is really important. I think that we're moving in the direction of having the rating adjustment because all sources have told us that ADM is going to decline in our schools. So while we want to watch it, we don't want to be punitive with it. So I think we've added the rating adjustment, but if we change the calculation as noted here, we just swing. It's like the rating adjustment will just fix the swing from having changed the calculation because it's a fairly significant decline. And I think that's that final bullet. It's like year 1 ADM minus year 3 ADM over year 3 ADM. Would that be right, Andrea? Is that what's causing this swing?
Actually, based on the information presented for the last meeting, that piece has, it's really considering the audited year growth rate that really is having the impact. There is a slight difference. There is like maybe 1 or 2 charters that may be pulled in based on that change in ADM consideration where we have the below, where we have a below standard being that you had a decline of 50% or more in your ADM between those 2 years. But it really is the audited, considering the audited year growth rate separate outside of the average that is really what was putting more, I guess, taking more people out of, or taking more schools out of meets and spreading them across either approaches or below.
Members, do you guys have questions on this? Do we have public comment?
Wendy?
Yeah.
Just looking at stakeholder feedback, Eileen Sigmund's comment about COVID and changes, and is that do we feel like, what staff's thoughts? Are we gonna catch something because of that, or is it appropriate to catch? Is that what we should be looking for?
I definitely have to defer to staff. My sentiment is we've got it right on getting rid of the small, medium, large, and we've got it right on the rating adjustment, but that we don't need to add the current audit year because of the considerations that Eileen said it for virtual schools, but it's really for all schools, to be honest. Our ADM right now is very unpredictable and definitely declining. But I defer, Ashley, Andrea, do you want to, from staff's perspective, speak to that?
Yeah, I think that this goes to Eileen's comment, but also to the reasons why staff put additional calculations in this measure is because, well, one, during the audit and performance and sunset evaluation by the Auditor General's office, it was noted that there were charters that had significant swings in ADM, and our current measure was not picking up on those swings because we were averaging, right? And so that's why these other two areas or measures are being proposed. I think going back to the reason for this measure is to look at the potential decline in revenue, right? Our charters are mainly sustained through ADM and enrollment at the state level. And that is their main source of revenue most often. And so making sure that we are being transparent about what truly is happening, I think is important. But to Eileen's statement, I think to the reality, right, that we are in a situation where there has been a decline in enrollment and there will continue potentially to be a decline in enrollment in the public sector in Arizona. It is still important to note what the true enrollment is, right? And the enrollment trends at each individual school. But again, taking into consideration that we did put that adjustment so that if schools, even though their enrollment is declining, if they're doing well financially, then absolutely we need to note that, hey, yep, they are declining in enrollment. It's a reality. But at the same time, being truthful and considerate that, yep, they're still doing well financially, so we're going to bring them all the way up to a meets. I think hopefully that the two recommendations here, the calculation change and that adjustment, is doing a good job in not over-identifying, but identifying the schools that are potentially declining in that revenue or are declining in that revenue that need to be watched.
Thank you, Ashley. Do you think our other measures hit revenue pretty good? Yeah, member Lewis.
No, I was looking at the very beginning where you had the two charter A, charter B, and the 3-year average. The problem with the average is that, and it's a small sample, 3 years, but it doesn't really count it's not like you'd have a standard deviation or something. I just did a quick calculation, and it wouldn't make sense to necessarily come up with a standard deviation for a 3-year period. But I think you got to have these two things, because I think the finances are going to be the measure. If somebody sees their enrollment declining and they're able to adjust to it and manage their finances, and not only their finances, but then they're also going to have all these other criteria, operational and educational criteria that they have to meet too. We're just looking at the finance, but if they're making the adjustments, I don't necessarily think it's we shouldn't be punitive if somebody's making adjustments and they acknowledge their enrollment is declining and they're still maintaining all these other factors.
I agree with you, Carlos. Do we have any public comment on this?
And Madam Chair, I think you all are saying it right. If the school is making adjustments and they're kind of keeping everything in check, that's a good thing. That's what we want schools to be nimble and to be able to react to whatever the circumstances is. So I think we got it here, but we'll take it back to and make sure we're missing.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, so I really don't know how. I'd like to present a motion to the group, but I'm not exactly sure how to extrapolate out what needs to be said. But I normally would make this motion and remove calculation and just say that we've got the rating adjustment right. But I think that the change in the calculation to get rid of small, medium, and large was very effective. But I don't think the considering audit year growth rate that shifts all these schools in the wrong direction is good. So I'm gonna try to make a motion that accepts every other piece of that and pulls this out. But let me know if I get my wording wrong. So I would move that the average daily membership rating adjustment as presented today and found in today's materials, with the presented measure changes to include the elimination of small, medium, large delineation, and to exclude considering audit year growth rate separately, be incorporated by staff into the subcommittee's draft recommendation to the board, which the subcommittee will finalize at a subsequent meeting. I think we would need to see a little data on that redone too in that subsequent meeting, just as a side note.
So was that the motion, Wendy?
Yes.
Because you did masterfully.
Thank you.
Second.
I was trying to find my unmute button there. Mr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller,
Aye.
motion passes.
Before we move on,
Yes.
so you want, when this comes back, you want to see data with the audit year growth rate removed, is that?
Yes, please. We would have
Okay.
to kind of recreate this report. Just removing that one item would be very helpful, I think, for that final review of it. Thank you, Andrea. Gosh, I think we might actually, I know we have a little time constraint, and I think we're going to make it. I'm optimistic. Okay, so we are moving on to item J, which is the default measure. This one's coming back on, I think, from our first meeting to review public comment.
Subcommittee members, at its October meeting, the subcommittee discussed possible changes to the framework's default measure. The subcommittee directed staff to solicit stakeholder feedback on whether the subcommittee should recommend adding an approaches standard option. Within the comment period, 2 stakeholders provided feedback on this item. The feedback may be found on page 1 of the staff report for this agenda item. Subsequently, the Arizona Charter Schools Association provided feedback, which was posted on the board's website with the agenda. Today, the subcommittee will review the stakeholder feedback and deliberate on the draft proposal found in the staff report. The draft proposal has also been included on on this slide. The proposed approaches standard option reads, for a loan agreement, facility agreement, or both, the lender or landlord has allowed the charter holder to pause or reduce payments for a period of time under a forbearance or similar agreement. Please note that if recommended by the subcommittee, the proposed approaches standard option would not be applicable to charter holders that proactively and voluntarily work with their lenders or landlords to renegotiate loan or lease terms. As long as these charter holders comply with the terms of their loans and leases, they will continue to receive a meet standard rating on the default measure. If the subcommittee proceeds with adding the approaches standard option, staff will add the word material so the language aligns with the language used for the other rating options. I'm available for questions.
Andrea, we have questions? Any public comment? based on the overall sentiment received in the last time this was discussed. I think it's fair to throw out a motion. I'm just making sure one more time we don't have any public comment. Okay. I would move that the default measure proposal as presented today and found in the materials for today's meeting be incorporated by staff into the subcommittee's draft recommendation to the board, and to be finalized by the subcommittee at a subsequent meeting.
Second.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Member Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller,
Aye.
motion passes.
Thank you. Moving on to the next item, scheduling and next steps. As mentioned a little earlier in the meeting, we had to push our net income measure to another subcommittee meeting. It seems to me too that it would be very helpful to go back and review all these items that are sent to the subsequent committee meeting. So feel free to jump in, Ashley, but I think we probably as a subcommittee, what we need to decide is if we want to hold a meeting simply for the net income, or if we want to hold a meeting for net income and to finalize these other recommendations, and then would present those to the full board. But we definitely need at least one more meeting.
Yeah, Superintendent Designee Miller, I agree with you. I think another meeting to, well, one, at least to go over the, excuse me, at least the annual net income. And then you did today vote to put out some items for public comment. And I think it'd be appropriate to put those items out for public comment that we have not received public comment on as of yet. Bring that back to you all for your consideration, and then build out the final recommendation to the full board at that time. So on my notes, based on today's meeting, I have that we still need to discuss the annual net income measure. The lease adjusted debt service covered ratio is going to go out for public comment, so that needs to be brought back as well. And then also you had requested that item D be brought back, and that was the factors affecting days liquidity. You just wanted that to be brought back for discussion. Andrea, do you have any other items that need to be brought back for discussion before going to the full board at this time?
I think we also have the option to use cash reserves that has to go out for public comment. And I would just bring up something, you guys can do with it what you want. With all of these proposals that we brought forward, we have, or you have, provided that preliminary 5-day comment period before you either recommended something for the draft recommendation or changed and updated for the draft recommendation. I don't know if you would like to have that same opportunity for the adjusted net income measure proposal, if you would like to have that have a preliminary like 5-day window before it is put out for the as the kind of recommendation to the board. That's your call. It can go either way, but just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, based on timing, I think that might impact whether our full recommendations went, in this month's or potentially the next month's agenda, Andrea. That's a good point. One thing I've seen that kind of fell off in one of the other meetings that was discussed, so we would want to make sure it got included on the next agenda, would be like the availability for a charter to comment. I think we might want to turn that into an action item. It was it's more of a procedural thing, but currently on the framework, there is nowhere for a charter operator to speak to a below or approaches if there's sort of a unique circumstance. And I know we had discussed, and there was an appetite for making that option available for schools. So I know it has some technical steps, but it would be good to be able to get it officially considered. Do we have any members of the public that would like to speak to items they would like to see on a future financial subcommittee agenda? Members, did we catch all of the things that are important to you to have on the next agenda? I agreed. Andrea just got a little shout out in the chat box, and I would have to say this. This is a lot of work and very complex. I'm very grateful for your patience and your time, both of you, and for really making sure that myself and the community understands what's being proposed. All right, hearing and seeing none. I'm just going to do one more chance for the public to speak up if there's anything you'd like to see on the next subcommittee agenda. Yeah, all right, so I think we're moving to agenda item M, Ashley.
I'm sorry, going back to
Yeah.
the previous agenda, it would be best if we could have a motion.
Oh, sure.
Sorry about that. And I'm happy to go through all the items one more time if you didn't write the list down. What would be best, Ms. Miller?
Is it possible to say items discussed today for future agenda, or you need me to delineate them?
Let me clarify, make sure we're all on the same page.
Okay.
Okay, so I have one, the availability for charters to comment and speak to the I don't even actually know what my note says here. So you wanted about comment on the dashboard. So what that technical process would be, and then we can discuss that. So yes, availability for charters to comment on the dashboard. There we go. Putting out the proposal for the cash reserves for public comment and then discussion at the next meeting. And then the lease adjusted debt service coverage ratio that's going to be put out for public comment and then will be up for consideration at the next meeting. The annual net income measure, which would need to be discussed for the first time and then potentially put out for public comment thereafter. Then we have public comment. Then we have item D, which is factors affecting day's liquidity, and that's up for discussion.
Did the UDL measure, was that one going out for? No. Let's see.
I don't
No,
believe.
no, that's moving to the final proposal. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it would just be the factors affecting the day's
Yeah.
liquidity.
Great.
Under
Thanks.
item D.
Okay, so I move that board staff work with subcommittee members to schedule a second meeting and schedule a subsequent meeting for the subcommittee to further consider and discuss the adjusted net income measure and those measures and items identified today for public comment and further discussion.
Do we have a second?
Yes, sorry. I was like considering if there was anything to add on to that, but I think I'm
I'll
solid.
second.
You're good. Sorry. I'm gonna cut you off.
Second, you still looking for a second?
Yes, thank you. All right, Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller. Sorry, Ms. Miller, I didn't hear you.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Great. Thanks for making sure we had what we needed on that. All right. Are there any current events, future meeting date, or future agenda items you'd like to speak to, Ashley, on item M?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Okay. This meeting, I believe, is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.